Pompeii is often imagined as a graveyard of stone, a city defined by its final moment. Yet what makes it extraordinary is not the violence of its destruction, but the astonishing clarity with which it preserves life. Nearly 2,000 years ago, on an ordinary morning in 79 AD, Pompeii was not a symbol of tragedy, but a thriving Roman town overlooking the glittering waters of the Bay of Naples. Bakers were already tending their ovens, merchants arranging goods in the forum, children running across mosaic floors, and slaves moving quietly through atriums open to the sun. Mount Vesuvius rose in the background, familiar and seemingly benign, a feature of the landscape rather than a threat. Nothing in the rhythm of that day suggested that it would be remembered for millennia. This is the paradox at the heart of Pompeii. The city feels alive precisely because it was interrupted mid-breath. The eruption that would soon entomb its streets also sealed its gestures, its routines, and its social order in place, allowing us to glimpse not just how Romans died, but how they lived. To understand Pompeii, we must momentarily forget what we know about its fate and step back into its present, into a world structured by prosperity, hierarchy, ritual, and habit. The true story begins not with ash falling from the sky, but with confidence. The confidence of a community integrated into the Roman world, supported by trade, agriculture, and civic pride, convinced of its stability. By reconstructing what daily life was like before the eruption, we uncover something deeper than historical detail. We confront a universal human condition, the quiet assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. Pompeii's streets were filled with ordinary expectations, not apocalyptic fear. And it is within that atmosphere of normalcy, of routine unfolding beneath an indifferent mountain, that the deeper meaning of the city emerges. Pompeii's confidence did not come from ignorance alone. It was also earned, built slowly through geography, labor, and the quiet mathematics of exchange. Set slightly inland from the shoreline, yet bound to the sea by roads and ports, the town sat in one of the most desirable corners of the Roman world, where volcanic soil turned agriculture into abundance, and the bay functioned like a natural marketplace. Vines climbed the slopes in orderly rows, yielding wines that traveled far beyond Campania, while olive groves and market gardens fed the daily appetite of the city and the surrounding countryside. Even the products that seem most Roman in their strangeness, like garum, the fermented fish sauce whose smell must have haunted workshops near the water, were part of a wider economy that rewarded specialization, routine, and scale. Pompeii was not an isolated jewel, it was a node, one pulse in a network of ships, carts, contracts, and coin. That network shaped the city's physical language. In Pompeii, prosperity was not merely stored, it was displayed, converted into stone and space in ways that made wealth feel permanent. The Forum stood as the civic heart, not simply an open square, but a stage where commerce, politics, and religion could be seen performing together, each legitimizing the other. Temples and public buildings framed the daily movement of bodies, making the city's order visible as people crossed from market stalls to administrative offices, from shaded porticos to sunlit steps. Water itself, the most ordinary miracle, arrived through controlled channels, feeding fountains and baths, announcing Roman engineering as an everyday convenience. Public baths were not luxury in the modern sense. They were an institution, a social equalizer, and a social filter at once, where the city's many layers rubbed against each other: citizens, freedmen, foreigners, the wealthy, the struggling, all submerged in the same warm air, yet never forgetting who had arrived with attendants and who had come alone. Pompeii's prosperity also created a ladder, and the rungs of that ladder can be felt in the names and ambitions etched into the city's surfaces. Roman society allowed certain kinds of ascent, especially for freedmen who, having once been enslaved, could accumulate wealth through trade, workshops, and property, then translate money into status by sponsoring buildings, games, or repairs. This is one of the quiet engines of Roman urbanism. The city grows because individuals want to be remembered inside it. A new fountain, a restored street, a donated statue base. These were not acts of anonymous generosity, but investments in reputation, the architectural form of a signature. In Pompeii, civic pride and personal ambition braided together so tightly that it becomes difficult to separate public benefit from private desire. The stone does not judge, it simply records the transaction. Yet wealth was never evenly distributed, and the city's beauty, for all its brilliance, was also a mask that depended on less visible labor. Behind the tidy facades, workshops rang with repetitive tasks. Cloth worked and dyed, metal hammered into tools, bread kneaded and baked in bulk. The streets carried the marks of movement and burden, grooves from cartwheels, stepping stones that let pedestrians cross when rain and waste turned the road into something foul. There is a kind of honesty in those worn surfaces, because they reveal that prosperity is not an abstract condition, but a daily achievement. Pompeii's merchants and artisans lived close to their work, often selling from the same buildings where they slept, blending commerce and domestic life until the boundary between them almost disappeared. Even the city's pleasures, wine shops, taverns, small eateries where warm food could be bought by those without elaborate kitchens, were part of the economy's circulation, keeping bodies fed so that bodies could keep working. And above this hum of trade rose the more curated symbols of Roman life. Paved streets aligned into recognizable grids, painted walls that turned homes into galleries, and villas that opened inward onto gardens designed to look effortless. In these houses, wealth spoke in details: imported marble, fine mosaics, mythological scenes painted with practiced hands, bronze lamps shaped like animals or gods. But the real luxury was not an object. It was space, the ability to create rooms that did not need to be productive, corridors that existed only to guide the eye, courtyards that captured light for its own sake. Pompeii's elite could afford to live as if their world were stable, and the city around them echoed that assumption. Public monuments celebrated continuity, and the routines of trade reinforced it. Every sale, every bath, every vote posted on a wall suggested that tomorrow would arrive in the same familiar shape. What makes this prosperity so haunting in hindsight is the way it amplifies the city's sense of normal life. Pompeii was not waiting for an ending. It was investing in the future, repairing streets, expanding buildings, commissioning art, arguing about politics, gossiping about scandals, living with the stubborn certainty that its place in the Roman world was secure. The bay glittered, ships moved, money changed hands, and the mountain watched like it always had, an accepted part of the horizon. In that balance between effort and expectation, between the visible confidence of stone and the invisible dependencies of networks, Pompeii reveals itself as something more than a famous ruin. It becomes a portrait of a society at full stride, so busy sustaining its prosperity that it could not imagine the ground beneath it had its own intentions. Pompeii's prosperity was not only counted in coins or measured in public monuments, it was lived through space, and space in Pompeii was never neutral. The city taught its residents who they were by where they could stand, where they could enter, and what they were allowed to see. From the street, facades presented a disciplined face to the world, plain walls punctuated by doorways and shop openings, yet behind them unfolded interiors arranged like social diagrams. The typical domus drew you inward through a narrow entrance into an atrium open to the sky, where a shallow pool caught rainwater and light fell like a quiet authority. This was not merely a practical design, it was a message. The house displayed order, control, and lineage, even when those things were newly acquired. Visitors were guided along intentional sight lines toward a garden peristyle, where columns framed greenery and painted walls extended the illusion of depth. In a city where reputation could be built, architecture became a form of rhetoric. It persuaded others that a family's status was natural, stable, and deserved. Yet the same urban fabric that held elegant villas also held crowded rooms above shops, narrow staircases leading to rented spaces, and workshops where domestic life and labor pressed against each other without pause. Many Pompeians did not live in courtyards and gardens, but in compact quarters where the street's noise was a constant companion and privacy was a luxury. Even so, these smaller spaces were not simply signs of deprivation. They were the living edge of the city's economy, the places where bread was baked, cloth was cut, and objects were produced for sale. In Pompeii, the boundary between home and workplace often dissolved, and that dissolution revealed how much of the city's comfort depended on relentless, ordinary effort. The same street that carried a senator's litter also carried sacks of grain, amphorae of wine, and the daily deliveries that kept households functioning. The streets themselves were another kind of architecture, shaping social life through movement. They were narrow, sometimes shadowed by upper stories, and designed for a traffic that was intimate rather than monumental. Stepping stones bridged the channeled roads, hinting at the less celebrated realities of an ancient city: mud, waste, runoff, while also revealing the ingenuity of adaptation. On these streets, hierarchy could be encountered at arm's length. A passerby might brush shoulders with a slave on an errand, a freedman counting profits, a child weaving between adults, or a wealthy patron surrounded by clients. Pompeii's social order was not hidden away in palaces. It was enacted in public, performed repeatedly until it felt like nature. Even the walls participated. Electoral slogans, advertisements for games, and sharp graffiti turned stone into a communal voice, mixing civic ambition with humor, insult, and desire. The city spoke constantly, and it spoke in layers. Inside the domus, hierarchy became even more explicit, encoded in rooms and thresholds. The grand reception areas were designed for display, places where a household could host, negotiate, and impress. But deeper within, the working spaces told another story. Kitchens darkened by smoke, storage rooms heavy with amphorae, small quarters where enslaved labor slept close to the tasks that would begin again at dawn. The Roman household was not just a family unit. It was an institution of power, a miniature economy with its own internal ranks. To walk through a wealthy house in Pompeii was to move through a social landscape as carefully arranged as any garden. The art on the walls, myths of gods, heroes, punishments, seductions, was not only decoration but a cultural code, reminding inhabitants and visitors alike of the narratives Rome used to explain authority, virtue, and fate. At the same time, Pompeii's built environment also reveals the aspirations and anxieties of those who lived between classes, especially freedmen. Their houses sometimes mimicked elite layouts, compressing atrium and garden into smaller footprints, using paint and illusion to create grandeur where stone could not. This imitation was not mere vanity. It was a claim, an argument that status could be constructed, that respectability could be staged convincingly enough to become real. In a society that valued public honor, the home was a theater where identity could be rehearsed and confirmed. Even modest households participated in this impulse, decorating shrines, arranging spaces for guests, cultivating small gestures of dignity in a world that measured people relentlessly. What emerges from Pompeii's architecture is a city that trained its residents to accept interdependence and inequality at once. The streets connected everyone, yet the doors separated. The baths mixed bodies, yet social distinction survived in subtle forms. The economy offered mobility, yet the household preserved domination. This is why Pompeii feels so vivid. Its ruins do not show only buildings, but relationships. Every threshold implies permission. Every corridor implies control. Every public square implies negotiation. The city's spaces held daily life in a particular shape, making routine possible and making social order feel stable. And when we imagine Pompeii on the day before the eruption, we should imagine not only its people moving through these streets and rooms, but the unseen logic guiding them. A logic of status, labor, and belonging so deeply built into stone that it seemed as permanent as the city itself. In Pompeii, the day did not unfold as a sequence of dramatic events, but as a pattern repeated so often it became almost invisible. Morning arrived with practical urgency. Doors opened, shutters lifted. The first voices carried down the streets, and the city's economy slipped into motion like a well-worn mechanism. Work began early because life demanded it, and because commerce depended on presence. Bakers fed furnaces until the air around their shops thickened with warmth and grain-sweet smoke, while nearby mills turned steadily, transforming wheat into flour with a rhythm that must have seemed as natural as breathing. Market stalls filled with produce from the fertile countryside, fish from the bay, jars of preserved goods, and amphorae stamped with names that linked local labor to distant buyers. The forum acted as both center and crossroads, drawing together not only trade but the subtle politics of looking and being seen. A citizen conducting business there was not only buying or selling, he was positioning himself within the city's social field, measuring reputation with every handshake and glance. But Pompeii was never only a city of labor. The same networks that kept it prosperous also made leisure possible, and leisure in Roman life was not simply rest. It was a public language, a way of belonging. By late morning, the baths began to fill, and the city's divisions softened without disappearing. In the warm chambers, conversation moved as freely as steam, carrying gossip, business arrangements, jokes, and quiet rivalries. Men compared bodies and fortunes, friendships were reinforced, alliances were tested. Outside, street food offered a different kind of community, practical and immediate. Many residents ate from small shops and counters because not every home was built for elaborate cooking, and the act of eating became a public habit rather than a private ritual. Wine shops and taverns, loud and intimate, gathered people who might never share a dining room, and in those spaces the city's pulse became audible. Entertainment pushed that pulse into something almost ecstatic. The amphitheater, looming as a statement of civic pride, promised moments when the entire city could look in the same direction and feel itself as a single body. Gladiatorial games were brutal, yes, but they were also moral theater, wrapped in ideas of courage, endurance, and spectacle. They allowed people to experience intensity together, to translate violence into meaning, to see discipline and skill where fear might otherwise dominate. Even those who disapproved could not entirely escape the gravity of such events, because public life in Pompeii, like public life in Rome, had a way of becoming unavoidable. Walls announced upcoming games, names of sponsors, boasts of fighters. The city advertised its own excitement, and alongside official messages, private voices scratched themselves into plaster. Declarations of love, insults, obscene jokes, arguments about politics, and small acts of rebellion against silence. In these markings, Pompeii becomes intimate. You can sense the personalities, the impatience, the humor, the hunger to be remembered, even if only by leaving a name where someone else might read it. Belief, too, ran through the ordinary like a hidden current. Religion in Pompeii was not an occasional encounter reserved for temples. It lived inside houses, at street corners, in gestures repeated without drama. Household shrines held small figurines and offerings, linking daily life to protective forces that felt close and personal. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were woven into the fabric of routine, invoked before journeys, thanked after profit, feared when illness arrived. Public temples rose in the forum as symbols of civic identity, reminding everyone that the city's order was not only human but cosmic, sanctioned by powers older and larger than any individual. Festivals and rituals punctuated the calendar, creating a sense that time itself was structured, meaningful, and shared. In a world filled with unpredictability, illness, accidents, sudden reversals, religion offered not certainty, but a framework for endurance, a way to interpret misfortune without being crushed by it. All of this, the work, the leisure, the belief, created a psychological shelter, routine as reassurance. Pompeii's residents lived inside a web of habits that made their world feel coherent, and coherence is a form of safety. The city's prosperity depended on constant movement and exchange, but for those who inhabited it, that movement became familiar, even comforting. They knew which streets led to which shops, which baths were busiest, which taverns were loudest, which household gods demanded the most attention. They knew the faces that mattered and the ones they could ignore. This is what makes the final day so difficult to imagine honestly, because disaster is easy to dramatize and ordinary life is harder to see. Yet ordinary life is where Pompeii truly existed. It was not a city waiting for ash. It was a city repeating itself, refining itself, sustaining itself through countless small actions that felt permanent, because they had happened before, and that permanence, built out of habit and shared expectation, was perhaps the most powerful illusion of all. Pompeii did not live in perfect ignorance of danger. It lived in familiarity with it, and familiarity has a way of dulling the sharp edge of fear. The ground in Campania was restless long before Vesuvius announced itself with fire and ash. Earthquakes had shaken the region in living memory, strong enough to damage buildings, topple walls, and force repairs that still marked the city's surfaces. Cracks were patched, columns reset, frescoes repainted where plaster had fallen away, and daily life resumed as if restoration itself were proof of invulnerability. A tremor becomes, over time, not a warning, but a rhythm, Another inconvenience folded into the ordinary, like heat in summer or storms at sea. When people rebuild, they teach themselves that the world can be corrected, that stability can be repaired into existence. In that sense, Pompeii's resilience may have strengthened the very illusion that made it vulnerable. The city's material culture carries hints of this uneasy normalcy. Some buildings show signs of renovation, scaffolding, unfinished work, evidence not of panic but of routine maintenance after repeated shocks. Life in a dense urban environment always demands constant attention. Roofs leak, walls crumble, pipes fail, and a city survives by treating damage as solvable. Pompeii's residents were not wrong to think this way, because most threats they faced were gradual and familiar. Illness, debt, social disgrace, crop failures, the occasional earthquake. These were dangers with known shapes, problems that could be managed through effort, prayer, connections, and time. The mind adapts to the kinds of risk it can name, and it learns to discount what it cannot. Vesuvius, silent on the horizon, belonged to the category of background, not the category of threat. There is also a deeper human pattern at work, one that transcends Pompeii and makes its story disturbingly modern: the normalization of recurring warning signs. When a signal repeats without immediate catastrophe, it stops feeling like a signal and begins to feel like weather. People adjust their expectations, recalibrate their sense of what is normal, and then build their lives inside that recalibration. A tremor that once would have emptied streets becomes a story told at dinner, a brief pause in conversation, a reason to joke nervously and then return to business. The same psychological mechanism that allows societies to endure chronic stress also allows them to ignore slow-building danger. In Pompeii, routine was not merely habit, it was a shield, protecting the mind from the exhausting possibility that everything could end at once. And yet, beneath the calm surface of ordinary life, the conditions that made the city possible were always more delicate than they appeared. Pompeii relied on water systems, food supply, trade routes, and dense social coordination, networks that worked so smoothly they became invisible. A city can feel permanent precisely because its dependencies are hidden, because its daily functioning masks the complexity required to sustain it. The more seamlessly a system operates, the less its inhabitants think about what would happen if it failed. Pompeii's streets, busy with commerce and conversation, were a triumph of coordination, and that triumph may have made it harder to imagine sudden collapse. The mountain was simply part of the scenery, like the sea or the sky, and scenery is not supposed to change. This is why the final hours of Pompeii are so haunting, even before we reach the moment of destruction. They were filled with choices made under the assumption of continuity. People went to work, negotiated prices, visited baths, argued over politics, tended household shrines, planned meals, repaired walls, and invested in a future they believed would arrive. Safety, for them, was not a guarantee granted by nature. It was a feeling produced by repetition, by the stubborn fact that yesterday had ended normally. The city's confidence was not foolishness, but something more human and more dangerous, an emotional contract with the familiar world, a belief that the patterns holding life together would continue to hold. Pompeii teaches with unsettling clarity that catastrophe does not always announce itself in a language people can understand, and that the most fragile moment in any society may be the one in which everything still seems to be working.